On this episode of China Unscripted, China is facing a serious water shortage. It's wrecking the environment and local industry. So investors had better watch out. Welcome to China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley John.
And I'm Matt Gnezda.
Joining us today is Andrew Eil. He's the head of climate risk for North America for Tata Consultancy Services. Andrew, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to start this off by all of us having a nice sip of water. Water is really great.
Okay, fine.
Yeah, our bodies, we really need water, don't we? So, what is this water crisis that China is facing?
So it's a big one, and it's been brewing for a long time.
Brewing?
The thing is, water is needed for a surprising and bewildering array of human activities, not all of which are readily apparent. But for
slip and slides?
Slip and slides, yes. Well, those I think are some of the more obvious ones. I'm personally always spend my time on a slip and slide when I can. But the manufacturing and power sectors are huge consumers. Agriculture is a huge consumer. And all these problems worldwide are really being exacerbated by climate-related changes that we're seeing. And so all of those have been building up, and it's getting dire in certain parts of the world, and China is among those that's most at risk.
Can you give us an idea of where the situation is now? Like, people still have water to drink, right? How bad is it?
So there is water to drink, and the thing is that water for home consumption is actually not one of the largest sources of consumption in China, or frankly in most places. In China, 60% of the water consumption is used by the industrial sector, and agriculture is also a really big consumer. So in local areas, where you may have shortages, we in the U.S. occasionally encounter these where you're asked, particularly out west, you're asked to take shorter showers or not water your lawn and things like that. That's when things get really extreme, usually for a short period of time. But that's not really where the main draws on the water demand are, right? And so you have a place like China that's such a huge industrial economy, and it really has taken this water use for granted in how it's constructed its economy. And when you combine that with the sheer number of people in China and the size of the economy, there's actually less fresh water per capita in China than in even some of the most arid regions of the world, which is pretty astonishing. And by UN definitions, China is actually facing acute water shortages by that per capita metric.
So, you talk about industry, right? So, like, let's say you're manufacturing, I don't know, a slip and slide. How does water, I'm just not picturing water being used in this machinery to make slip and slides or microchips or whatever it is.
Sure. So, look, I'm not an engineer, nor necessarily an expert in the finer points of manufacturing. So this is a little out of my sweet spot, but there are some types of uses for water. One is simply as an input for raw materials, right? And so you have things like grain for food, you have cotton for textiles, you have other kinds of metals and construction materials. Almost anything you can think of that's used to make stuff tends to require a lot of water in that initial production or refinement. So that's a big one. You also have many manufacturing processes themselves that require water. And that really just is very specific to a given industry. But water is very commonly used for cooling. It's used for washing. It's used for purifying or filtering. And so there are all kinds of different functions in a wide range of manufacturing facilities that are extremely highly dependent on water. Even though, how you manufacture slip and slide, I couldn't tell you. I don't know exactly what the water demand of that slide is. But certainly the stuff that's going into it is requiring a lot of water.
So how did China get to the situation where it has less water per capita than like desert countries? Was it like a drought? Was it bad government policy? Was it a government-caused drought?
So I'd say it's a bit of all of the above, right? I think that so going back to the statistic that I mentioned, that 65% of China's water use is from industry, right?
Does that include agriculture, or is agriculture on?
No, it does not include agriculture. So agriculture is separate, and on top of that, in places like the U.S., where you have entire states in the Great Plains that are primarily centered around the industrial agricultural economy, that may be the biggest draw on water demand, such as in the Oklahoma.
Yeah, and the good news is that our manufacturing in this country has been hollowed out and sent to China, so we don't have to worry about that problem.
That is true. That is true. And even at our height of manufacturing in the U.S., I don't think we were ever quite the world's manufacturing hub to the degree that China is. Even in the mid 20th century, there was a more, I think, diversified economy, whereas China not only has this comparative advantage that it's developed, but it's also a product of government policy, right? That it has invested in infrastructure and manufacturing capability rather than in the consumer economy, right? And there are a number of reasons for that, those sort of political economic realities. But the fact remains that the economy is heavily built around manufacturing capability and industry. What that means is that is so dominant that it has, in recent decades, dramatically increased the demand for those freshwater resources. Now, you put that on top of the fact that particularly the northern China plain is a fairly arid region and has limited natural rainfall and freshwater sources from rivers and lakes. And you have the fact that China is home to a huge number of people. So simply any per capita metric is a reflection of that, really big denominator. So what that means is you have these various different stresses, right, and pressures, and that has really been accelerated by the industrial policy of China, the real expansion of the economy very rapidly, and other factors like climate change. So it's kind of a perfect storm.
When you talk about water being used for manufacturing, after that water goes into manufacturing, can it be recycled? Can it be renewed? Or is it kind of like, is there a way to recover some of that?
It depends on the use, right? Where water is used for cooling and there's no degrading of the quality of water, it simply needs to, come back to normal ambient temperature after its use. It very much can be reused, and that can be something for which plants are designed. Most plants are not designed that way because they were built for a world of ample water, where you're not kind of optimizing for scarcity, right? You're optimizing for price and performance efficiency, right? So that's really something that is a problem all over the world and needs to change, right? But in some cases, you can reuse the water, but you'd have to retrofit your facilities to do so. And in other places, the water is actually degraded, right? It's polluted, it's salinated, it's somehow less pure or fit for use after it has gone through its process, right? Imagine using for mining, right? Or for washing coal or something like that. The water's really dirty when it's done. And sometimes that it can be then cleaned and purified through water treatment, though that itself is expensive and energy intensive. most often, you use some basic pollution remediation methods, and then it is allowed to drain off into the nearest body of water, right? And that's by design. So that is something that fundamentally doesn't really account for the scarcity that China and many other places are now experiencing.
Yeah, I don't really have a sense of China being a place that's really
About water reuse.
water reuse, recycling, cutting back on pollution. So are they basically not taking these steps?
Well, to transform a large industrial facility, let alone an entire economy, right, around new principles of water preservation and conservation, isn't something that happens overnight. So in some cases, it's happening. I think there has not really been a concerted national push for water conservation, in part because it's the kind of out of sight, out of mind problem that has driven a lot of natural resource challenges. And, it's just something that human society is not very good at, right? Without picking on the Chinese, there are, not many societies that do manage their water demand very well, frankly. And places that have water scarcity are reaching up, bumping up against these natural limits first, right? Some places like Israel have, for many decades, or practically all of its existence, have been building an industrial economy in an environment of acute water scarcity. Places like that had to optimize for water scarcity from day one have done better. Most places in the world are not in that category, and they are having to relearn how to function, to build their economy in a way that is really dealing with this constraint.
So if China were to continue on the trajectory it's on now, what would the situation look like 50 years from now, 100 years from now, assuming nothing changes?
Well, I don't think we have to look 50 or 100 years. I would say, 50 to 100 days might do the job, right? Over just the last couple of years. So I don't mean to be alarmist, right? I mean, China is not like, people are not going to die of thirst, in 2023 in China. But even looking at the last couple of years of where they already are and what they've experienced has shown that the drought conditions, limited rainfall, often exacerbated by heat waves, are leading to pretty acute water shortages that are, in some cases, leading to direct curtailment of water allocations for the manufacturing sector, and are also having knock-on effects for the power sector, right? So electricity generation, which in most of its forms requires a lot of water, and I can talk about that separately. The water crisis is leading to a power crisis, because if all your power plants or most of your power plants require water to function, no water means no power. And then no power creates its own set of problems, right? In some cases that compound the water issues. So you're seeing curtailments in the water sector. You're seeing curtailments in the power sector, and both of those have been directed by government policy to impact industry first. So you're seeing furloughs and mandatory closures of industry already in the last couple of years. That's sort of the tip of the spear, right? Some sectors get hit first. And that's already happening, right? There's just not enough to go around. And so you essentially then are in a world of rationing. And then it's often a matter of government policy, as well as, constraints of infrastructure and geography to figure out who gets to use the water that's left.
That's what happened this past summer, right? When there was like massive heat wave in parts of like Sichuan, Chengdu. Like I remember them. You remember the photos of like they shut the subway down, or like they weren't powering it with, like, they didn't have the lights on, so people were riding the subway in the dark during the heat wave.
Well, that's right.
But I also ironically remember the subways that were caught in the floods.
Oh yeah, that was a different time.
Well, yeah, but like this is the weird thing that's happening. There is like in some places way too much water all at once, and in some places there's just not enough.
But maybe the Communist Party can, distribute all the resources equally.
Take water from the south and move it to the north?
If only there was some kind of, water project that could handle that.
Well, that is a good question. What about the
What is it, South North Water Project?
Yeah.
So there are a couple really big water projects, mega infrastructure projects, and there are a couple of issues here. One is the fact that the amount of water that's needed to really make a dent in the problem is mind-bogglingly enormous, right? So you need a lot of water, right? And getting it across hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers of very difficult terrain, often difficult substrate, building these pipelines, these are often unprecedented engineering challenges, let alone the cost. On top of that, you have the fact that southern China, which is where they're looking to draw the water from, is now having its own water shortages, many of those driven by climate change. Those are newer developments by and large. Those are, of course, exacerbated by the very rapid economic growth in China, which has been heavily concentrated in many cases in the southern part of the country. So anything that requires water, anything that's bringing in more people, whether it's the Pearl River Delta, Guangzhou, Guangxi, pick your southern region. There is increasing demand on the resources they have, as well as these droughts that are becoming more acute in the south of the country, which is where that water is supposed to come from, right? To slake the thirst of the north. So it's an unproven premise that these massive water shifting infrastructure projects are capable of solving the problem.
I do want to ask about hydroelectric power, actually, because it's been so much a part of China's identity in a lot of ways. Like, my grandfather worked on a hydroelectric dam, and there was so much, the Three Gorges, being such a huge dam, and the government was, trumpeting as this huge achievement. And
yeah, it was very much like a cultural thing. Like, this is the Communist Party struggling against heaven and earth and creating this new China.
And just, being able to build these huge feats of engineering, right? These dams all along.
I mean, there's also more than 2,000 smaller dams, I think, across the country.
Yeah. So lots of dams. How does that fit into the picture of the water crisis?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Hydropower is a huge part of the power mix. It's a building block of the national economy. As you were mentioning, it's sort of part of the cultural identity of modern, communist era China. That you have kind of the 20th century industrial mentality of conquering nature, right, or harnessing nature in the service of industry, right, and human society. And that's largely been an accomplishment, right, of China as well as other industrialized countries, is really taking advantage of these resources through feats of engineering. And those are undoubtedly success stories, right? The Three Gorges Dam and these other giant new dams that China is still developing and bringing online, the Baihatan project, are 10 gigawatt project. These are among the very, very largest hydropower projects ever undertaken in the world, anywhere. And they have been successes. There are, the book isn't closed though, right? Because even having built a dam and gotten it to function, you still need regular flows of water to replenish the dam so that it continues to serve its purpose. And there are also impacts of damming these major rivers downstream. Now, in China, the dams were often quite purposely constructed to prevent the devastating flooding that would previously happen in the Yangtze Basin and other places, right? So there are benefits that come from harnessing and controlling these natural forces, right? But they also can have adverse effects. And those adverse effects, such as, you don't have enough silt, that then is sort of a natural fertilizer, right, for farmland that's on the riverbanks. You can exacerbate the water availability issues that may exist seasonally or during times of drought downstream, right? Because you've restricted the flow. And you may also have issues in the body of water itself, right? And so, silt can build up in dams, and you need to have a certain amount of the water body, the reservoir behind the dam, filled for the dam to actually function as a hydropower source. The U.S. West, by the way, is also really suffering from this. Hoover Dam, is having a catastrophic crisis, and it may lose its ability to generate hydropower this year because of an acute drought. And so these are ongoing issues that China is facing at Three Gorges and other dams, right? So it's both, I would say it's more a symptom of the problem, its vulnerability, than a cause, because the water still is usable, right? However, actually, there are also some ways that hydroelectric dams can consume water, which may be a little counterintuitive. But when you dam a river, right, and you create a lake, the water tends to get warmer because it's just sitting there rather than flowing. And it also evaporates more. And so you are actually using or losing more of the water to evaporation often when you have a lot of these dams. So there is sort of a contribution to the water crisis, but more, I would say, the hydropower sector is a part of the power generation vulnerability that I was talking about, right? You have the other sectors, other types of power generation also demand water, which I can talk about. Hydro is obviously, a sector that is entirely dependent on water. And so, your dam isn't full, you can't use your hydropower dam resource.
So what about other types of power? So China also has coal power, and they have nuclear power.
The people's power.
Right. So how are those affected by this water crisis?
Well, everyone knows the people's power is unlimited, right? So that's not a problem.
That's true.
So hydropower, just to kind of give a sense of how enormous China's power sector is. So China has 350 gigawatts of hydropower, which is a giant fraction. I don't have the exact number, but I think it's maybe nearly half of global hydropower capacity. And that is only about 16% of China's overall power generation, right? So it's a chunk, right? It's a slice of the pie, but it's actually far from the biggest slice of the pie. The biggest slice of the pie remains coal.
Beautiful coal.
Beautiful coal. Thermal power, which is coal as well as natural gas or oil or any other fossil fuel that you're burning to turn a turbine and create electricity. That still accounts for about 70% of China's current power output. So when you think about where is China's power coming from, the first thing you should always be thinking about is coal, right? Coal is also very dependent on water. Why is it dependent on water? It's dependent on water at all stages of the process for mining, for washing coal, often for transporting coal from the mine to its end industrial or power use, often on rivers, on barges. And then it's also used for cooling. So in thermal power plants where parts of the plant get really, really hot, the way that you maintain their function is through cooling. Now, there are some ways that can be done with air, but because air cooling is less efficient and more expensive, most plants have been built in a manner to be water cooled. And in a world where water is abundant, you just, sit your plant on the nearest river or seacoast or lake, and voila, you have your water. The problem is when you have a water crisis, then you are literally left high and dry, right? And so these thermal power plants also have a direct knock-on impact during the water crisis. And so in extreme cases, the power output of these coal plants has to be curtailed, just like the hydropower is curtailed. And so those actually compound and become an even bigger problem. And that's even further compounded by the fact that if it coincides with, say, a heat wave, everyone turns up their air conditioner and the demand for power goes way up just as the supply is cratering, right? And that's often the kind of thing that leads to blackouts or to failures on the power grid due to these environmental factors. And it is both a chronic and an acute challenge that China is dealing with, and it's a challenge that's not going away.
Now, given that so much of China's energy is produced by coal, and that coal requires water for washing and mining. Now, you mentioned the water used for cooling can often be cycled back, but if you're washing coal, like that just creates polluted water, right?
That's right.
What happens to that?
Quite literally dirty fact, right? That there are all kinds of industrial uses and, extractive industry uses of water that result in polluted supply. And, often it just, it goes into the nearest body of water or some kind of containment facility. And that is sort of the very unsatisfying answer of where polluted water goes, right? There are environmental regulations that require remediation or treatment in many cases. Those rules are sometimes followed, sometimes they're not. And then the water is not only essentially consumed or, useless after that, but of course it can also pollute the environment, right? And then cause problems in whatever locale that water has been dumped.
So it can pollute the soil too.
Exactly.
So this is really win-win-win because coal's polluting the air and the water and the soil. It's really kind of covering all the bases there.
Well, if you're looking for the pollution trifecta, you found it with coal, right? It has its dirty reputation for a reason.
It's great because, since China is a developing country, despite being the second largest economy in the world, according to their Paris Climate Agreement, they get to actually burn more coal and increase until 2030. And then maybe they'll start to cut back.
Yeah, until they change the deal.
Yeah. So are we headed to Dune, Arrakis, Desert Planet?
I was actually thinking Waterworld, but that's like a totally different premise.
Isn't that the opposite?
Yeah, but the problem isn't like the ocean levels on the Pacific coast of China might be rising slightly the way that it is globally, right? But that's salt water, so you can't do anything with that. You have to, we're talking about a freshwater crisis, not a saltwater crisis, right?
It depends on the use, right? In most cases, it is a freshwater crisis. Certainly, the oceans are rising, not falling, right? So, anything that's on the coast that's using seawater is probably less of a threat. But there are some caveats to that. First of all, there are limited uses for seawater, right? It can be used for cooling, but it certainly doesn't substitute for many freshwater uses like irrigation, certainly household use, things like that, right? You're not going to use seawater for that. So it has to be a usage that seawater can fulfill. Even the cooling issue can be a problem because this is less an issue with the ocean. It tends to happen more with rivers and lakes. But if the water warms up, say during a heat wave, it no longer has the same capability to cool, right? And so, if you're trying to cool something off by dumping a bucket of hot water on it, it's not going to do the job that a bucket of cold water would. And so it happened actually in many of the European countries that were impacted by the heat wave last summer that nuclear power stations, which are also rely on water to cool, many of them that are sited on rivers, actually had to cut back their production because the water wasn't cool enough to cool the plants. And you can have the same thing with coal. So you have temperature-related vulnerabilities, even when you may actually still have water to use. And so that, in some cases, can also impact coastal seawater.
Now, speaking of coastal seawater, so like you mentioned Israel, that has a really acute, they have an ongoing water shortage, right? That they've had for 70 years, or probably forever. And Israel uses a lot of desalination, which is basically taking salt water or brackish water, removing the salt through some process, and then that becomes potable water or drinkable water. So
exactly, yeah.
So how about China? Like China's got plenty of coast. There's still lots of salt water. Why not just solve the freshwater shortage by building lots of desalination plants?
It's a great question. The answer is in part that China is doing that, right? There is some effort to increase desalination as a source of fresh water. The problem is there are some limits to that. Statistics that I've seen indicate there are about 20,000 desalination plants globally. The output of all of those global plants would be enough to provide only about 6% of China's water needs. So the scale of desalination that would have to be done to make a serious dent in the problem is just astronomical, right? It doesn't work well at large scale, right? You can do it in small countries or in cities, particularly if you're using that water use for, residential, household or office consumption. Because as I mentioned, those are much smaller sources of water demand than industry or agriculture, right? So you have that problem, right? It's simply the scale problem is big. There are other problems as well. It's really expensive. It happens to generate water only on the coast, right? So that it can be then difficult to transport that water to where it needs to go for its use, right? It still may not, your coastal water that you've desalinated isn't going to help you address your water scarcity in Anhui, right? Or Sichuan, right? The water's not in the right place. And one additional problem is the fact that desalination is incredibly power intensive, right? Electricity intensive. It takes a lot of energy. And so China is already facing a power crisis, right? So the question is, are they really going to divert their existing power capacity to desalination when they already don't have enough power to go around? So you're sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul if you take that approach, because it then exacerbates other problems they have that are interlinked.
Right. So desalination needs power, and power needs water. Yeah, this is bad. Although what's worse is that I realized that I was calling it desalinization when it's actually just desalination.
Well, no, it's both. You can desalinize water.
That's right. It's both. It's both. It's absolutely both.
I've said desalinize too. So either we're both wrong together, and you're in my company, whether that's good or bad, or there are multiple ways to say that, in which case you're in the clear.
But at any rate, it could be a solution so people don't die of thirst, but it's not going to solve the industry problem at all. And it's probably not even enough to really do that much with agriculture.
Precisely.
Okay. So basically, that's not going to work. China's screwed.
Well, it does seem like it's coming to a head where it's going to affect food production, and China already has food production issues. It's going to affect power production, which China already has power issues. It's going to affect industry, could cause economic issues. It seems like this is just creating a whole host of problems that at any point could just implode.
It's not going to be. It's not like a tornado, right? They see this coming.
They see it coming, but you know, turning the Titanic is hard, right? They have their current economic model, they have their current industry, their current infrastructure, their current population, and those are things that are not readily changed at scale very quickly, right? So while it may not hit as a crisis between today and tomorrow, you still can have a seasonal drought, right? That becomes very, very acute over the span of, say, several months and can dramatically accelerate, right, the urgency of this kind of a crisis. And you simply can't adjust the supply levers fast enough, right? The only thing you can do is curtail demand, and you do that with rationing, right, or cuts. And so that is what we've already seen during scattered stretches. And unfortunately, those are problems that are likely to get a lot worse before the government or anyone else is able to make them better, right? I mean, there have been efforts to make industry more water efficient, to promote water conservation, to increase the price of water. You know, water in many places is either free or heavily subsidized, which is nice if you're a user, but it removes the incentive to conserve, right? And so that is an incentive that often needs to be put in place. And it's painful, but it then sends an economic signal that aligns the incentives of the users with the societal need to cut back, right? The problem is those kinds of things are extremely politically unpopular, and they're very hard to do without a lot of pain if you do it in a very short amount of time. And, you know, there are very few governments that have succeeded in doing that kind of thing, right? I mean, one of the secrets for Israel, which we've mentioned again, is just everyone knew from the beginning that there was no water. So you had to build from the outset with a mentality that water is really scarce. Otherwise, you got to move someplace else. In places where you're used to consuming a lot of water, you know, just it's human psychology that changing behavior or just shifting an economic model is extremely difficult, both, you know, psychologically and politically. And then you also have to retool your whole economy, right? Or your whole society around infrastructure that recognizes that scarcity and operates under those constraints.
Also, I feel like communist China is more of a society that's like they do better with rationing than they do with like free market price approaches to incentives. Like that's just kind of what they're used to for the last many decades.
So the rationing approach, you know, solves the problem in the short term, right? It keeps you from having total chaos when the government can step in and say, you know, you're getting water or power and you have to shut down until the crisis is over, right? So you have kind of a conductor or quarterback, you know, pick your analogy, who's calling the plays. And so on a superficial level, that solves the short-term acute problem. But even that, of course, comes at a high cost when you are preferencing, say, household consumption over industry. But what happens when you shut down industry, right? It means your people are out of work. They're furloughed. It means you're not meeting your international contractual obligations. It means, you're not generating foreign trade, right? And so part of the reason that many companies and societies globally are diversifying their supply chains away from China, the factory of the world, is because of these natural resource constraints, right? Now, there are, of course, a host of other reasons, you know, political, economic, you know, what have you. That's maybe subject for another conversation. But one of those reasons is because natural resources are so strained from decades of unbridled growth, right? That are now kind of, those problems are coming home to roost. That when you have the world's biggest industrial base, that has a major environmental impact, right? And you can maybe mask the effects of that for some period of time, but you can't mask them forever, particularly as you continue to grow. And so that's a problem for which China's on the front lines, though, of course, it's not a unique problem to China. And other regions are grappling with that too.
Right. So like take Apple, for example. Apple has recently been diversifying its manufacturing, I think, to India and Brazil. And for certain laptops, I think they're even doing it in Texas, yet another country. And like
Lone Star Republic forever. Yay, Texas.
I assumed that Apple was doing it because they were upset about the genocide of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but maybe it also has to do with other factors.
I think there are a lot of factors. I don't even know if the Xinjiang situation is front of the list, right? They just had all.
I'm kidding. It's probably not on their list.
Well, I mean, I think
yeah. So sorry. My antennae for sarcasm are sometimes a little challenged on Friday.
No, I apologize because none of my jokes are funny.
I do think that the U.S. government did make that a problem for Apple, though, with their their forced labor bill.
Yeah.
So that probably moved it up.
I'm glad I got my iPhone back when I could still get it with slave labor.
There you go.
Anyway, go on. So there's a water manufacturing, et cetera. So how would that affect a company like Apple?
Well, a lot of high-end electronics, again, believe it or not, the manufacturing does require a lot of water, right? So I don't know exactly the nuances of how water is used in some of those high-tech facilities, but suffice it to say that they are also impacted by a water crisis. And so that is one of many, many supply chain issues that are causing disruptions, right? I mean, you have COVID, you have labor unrest, you have trade wars and things like that. But you also have these natural resource constraints and natural disasters that are also playing a major role. And in general, it's an object lesson for the need to diversify supply chains, right? Because you don't want to have all of your supply chain to be in a region that's hit by a drought that then has a water crisis and a power crisis. You have to have some supply chain diversification to try to protect from that kind of thing.
Do you think that's why Elon Musk diversified into Twitter?
Well, yeah, certainly opinions and words are things that are seldom in short supply, right? So I think that we're not going to have, emojis, right? We're not going to have an emoji deficit anytime soon. So maybe it was a smart play.
Yeah. Which is because of Tesla
in China. Yeah, I think Tesla is getting hit pretty badly by a lot of this stuff in China.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Tesla is not just hit by manufacturing issues; they're also hit by being ripped off by, China's homegrown electric vehicle companies that are doing it for cheaper. So that's a whole other issue.
But so I'm curious, like, what can China do about this? Because, like, I know with their food shortage, they're hoarding most of the world's grain. When they completely overfished their oceans, they went abroad and overfished other people's oceans. Like, is this going to be a situation where they're, like, taking water from just other parts of the world? That doesn't seem realistic.
I think this is, like, the North-South Water Project problem. It's not really that easy you can't easily get, like, a water pipeline from Russia or something like that.
Or can you?
So, these are actually good questions. I think the answers are several-fold. In some cases, of course, they can try to dam up and divert water from these international rivers, right? Like the Mekong, most of which start up in the Himalayas and then flow through the Southwest, Kunming and that region, and then out into South Asia or Southeast Asia. They can potentially try to tap those rivers more and divert them, right? Which wouldn't make them a lot of friends in the region, but would potentially help address some of those needs. Other strategies include outsourcing, what's sometimes called embodied water, right? So instead of making something at home with your own water, you buy the product from someone else, you import it, and you make them use their water, right? And China does a lot of this by exporting its agricultural capacity, right? So by importing, say, animal feed, right, it means they are then relying on Brazil's water or the US's water to produce that animal feed that they then buy, right? Or just the actual food itself, right? Produce or anything else, right? Meat, right? Even meat, has a major water cost, right? How much water went into the, did the cows drink, right? Or went into the production of the food that the cows ate, right? These are not trivial issues. And China has done a lot of that, actually, and they lease agricultural land in other countries like Russia, places in Africa, places in the US. I mean, you name it, actually. That is an explicit strategy. Now, of course, it cuts both ways because you may then reduce your demand for water at home, but you're then increasing your dependence on these agricultural products and their importation, right? So, you still are dependent on something somewhere, but it is one way to manage the water crisis, right? Is to then, offshore those forms of productions that are water intensive.
Yeah, I understand that California exports a lot of alfalfa to China, which is great because California doesn't have any water shortages.
Exactly. Well, that I caught the sarcasm there, and it was very well placed. And yes, the California water crisis is a linked topic that is also worthy of a podcast. U.S. has plenty of its own issues, California, Texas, and elsewhere. So China is far from alone, but the scale and urgency is unmatched by most places. So that's why it's such an issue for China, and frankly for the rest of the world. Right? The converse of China buying its products from the rest of the world that embody water is, of course, the rest of the world is dependent on Chinese manufacturing and production, which uses Chinese water. So the China water crisis becomes everyone's water crisis, right? Through the supply chain connections.
Yeah. So, I mean, I understand that like they could alleviate some of the agricultural pressure on water, but if they start to like try to export that manufacturing, like that basically means they're not as valuable. Like their economy is built around like this type of like manufacturing. So is that a possibility for them to let some of that go to other places, or do they have to restructure how they manage the economy basically?
100%. So, I think it's a multi-pronged strategy, right? China has many reasons for needing to diversify its economy. The natural resource demands of the manufacturing-oriented economy is only one of them, right? And they have, it seemed like at the beginning of, President Xi's tenure that they were committed to that kind of structural reform, and we've seen over time that it hasn't really happened, right? Because it's hard. It's politically difficult. It's economically difficult. It's difficult with the political system that China has to have a consumer-oriented economy, and it also is just something that takes a long time. So in the meantime, while they're trying to diversify the economy, they need to employ conservation. And so there's the smart way to do it, which is to, do more with less, right? You build facilities that are optimized for efficiency. And then there are the hard ways to do it, which is where you start cutting people off and rationing. And unfortunately, cutting people off and rationing is often the only thing that works in the short term. And so if the onset of the problem comes faster than the solutions, then it's going to be really painful. And there's going to be a lot of that sort of crisis management mentality to address it.
Yeah, I imagine it's probably going to be especially bad now because it seems the indications from like the policy speeches and things that are coming out of the Communist Party in the wake of zero COVID, they're cutting back on a lot of things that they said that they were going to do, and it seems to be that they're having money issues because of how badly the economy did in the last 3 years. So I imagine that like that's only going to have a huge impact on how much they're able to do to handle something like a water crisis too.
Undoubtedly, there are a lot of economic headwinds in China right now. Right, there's sort of the recovery from the zero COVID policy, as you said. There's the slow motion, real estate bubble deflating. You have huge amounts of debt, public and private, in China. So there are a lot of issues that, frankly, many of those plague the West as well, right? You have the demographic crisis. Now the China's workforce is shrinking. Its population may begin shrinking as early as this year. And so these are major structural issues that create headwinds for investing in, the 21st century economy. And these are hard problems.
Yeah. Now, BlackRock has recently suggested that we triple our investments in China. Would you say that's enough, or should we really quadruple them?
Well, it depends how much money you've got. I'd say quintuple them, right? If you're rolling in cash,
especially if you're rolling in other people's cash.
If you're rolling in
Like
other people's,
BlackRock?
that's the best money to spend.
Yeah.
Open the spigots.
Amen. Because there's not water coming out of those spigots anytime soon. So, I mean, obviously, I think it's pretty clear that, like, if China's manufacturing collapses, the impact that would have globally. But what are some other ways that China's water crisis will impact the globe?
So I think some of the disruptions that we've seen in trade and supply chains, you have the trade war that Trump started, you have COVID, you have the Russia-Ukraine crisis, you have political tensions over Taiwan and other issues. All of these have kind of put kinks in global supply chains, right? And led to disruptions and shortages and things like that. And I think that these natural resource problems that will periodically constrain or even cripple parts of industry are a sign that these supply chain issues, and frankly inflation issues as well, are not going to go away. They're likely to persist and in many cases even get worse, right? So I think we are just in a new world where, the blue skies sort of just-in-time delivery of anything you've ordered is perhaps a thing of the past, right? Because there are so many of these crises lurking, many of them interrelated. So I think that's a challenge. There's also been a lot of speculation about the political blowback of this kind of a crisis, right? Some people have speculated that if these natural resource crises become economic crises, that there's always sort of the oldest play in the politician's playbook is jingoism, right? And then you kind of turn to nationalism and kind of foreign military adventures and things like that. So I think there is some speculation and fear that if these issues cause instability or discord at home, that then may then be sort of reflected and magnified on the international stage. That's, of course, speculative, but problems at home do sometimes lead to those kinds of problems being outsourced abroad, right, politically. And so those are something to look out for as well.
So maybe it'll give China finally an excuse to invade Russia.
Well, it's funny, people talk about that because there's a lot of farmland in Russia, right? And China actually already leases a lot of farmland in Western Siberia, where there is a lot of water, a lot of land, and not a lot of people. And so there are very serious thinkers who actually believe that may happen.
Did you know Siberia has been part of China since ancient times?
Yeah, well, China also gets a lot of its grain from Ukraine. So if Russia completes its invasion of Ukraine and then China takes over Russia, it'll by extension get Ukraine. So then problems will be solved. It's actually maybe a much better military investment than taking over a small rock in the South China Sea like Taiwan.
Might be a little harder to take over Russia. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, a wise man once said, never start a land war in Asia.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, this is above my pay grade, right? But interesting food for thought. Well irrigated food for thought.
There you go.
Hopefully, we can also have some water for thought with that food for thought.
Well, without the water, you're not going to have the food.
That's true. That's true. Something for thought.
Speaking of water, I'm empty here. Could you guys fill me up?
I know. I've been drinking more water this whole podcast.
Just in case we run out. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man, I feel a little guilty with my constant sous videing and watering my enormous lawn, and all the shot glasses of water I pour out for my homies. Seems like a waste.
And also, of course, the slip and slide.
That's necessary.
Well, I think if you invest in slip and slides, that's the takeaway, right? Is invest in slip and slides produced in other countries, right? That's where the BlackRock dollars should be going.
Good point. Or maybe some kind of Jello-based slip and slide.
Still needs water.
Still needs water. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for joining us today. This was very interesting to hear about just more of the ways we're all very, very screwed.
Well, I work on climate change for my day job. So, grappling with that problem is what happens every day when I get out of bed. So,
but I heard on the internet that climate change is a myth.
Well, okay. We're done here.
Okay. It was just getting
your
good.
Favorite myth signing off.
All right. Thanks, Andrew.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this interview made me think of so many different sci-fi properties. I mean, you got Dune, Waterworld, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, a lot of Asimov writings, Southland Tales. You see that movie?
No.
It was garbage.
Okay.
One of the worst movies I've seen. I don't recommend
And
it.
that
It stars
comes
The
from
Rock.
you. That comes from you, who you have like a very quirky taste in movies. The last movie that we all watched together was
Thermi-Romi.
Hey, that was great.
I'm just saying you have a quirky taste in movies.
Yeah.
Remember when Matt and I just quit during Happiness of the Katakuris?
That was your failing.
We did finish watching The Room together, and
but I remember,
that was actually. I'm glad that I went through that.
But I remember our friend Thomas, like after The Room was over, he just like got up and left the room.
Yeah, Southland
He
Tales.
didn't just leave a room; he left the room.
Okay.
The room. Yeah, Southland Tales is just unwatchably bad.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like
Justin
worse
Timberlake is in it, but like they give him a big ugly scar.
Worse
The Rock
than,
is in it.
What was the one with Sean Connery?
Zardoz?
Yes.
Wait, doesn't that movie take place in 2023?
Zardoz?
The one with Sean Connery wears that like singlet,
Does
right?
it? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that could be the world we're living in.
No, I don't think so.
We can't because Sean Connery has unfortunately passed away.
Well, there are some lessons from that movie that are still relevant today. Things I won't say on this podcast.
Yeah, no, you better
I have
not.
not watched anything from that except like a clip you sent me of like a mountain that like belches guns or something.
Yeah. It was a flying head rock.
Yes, okay.
Obviously. Man, the real world is so much more depressing. Yeah, this is crazy. Like it's like it's a Gordian knot of trouble.
So you just have to slice through it?
There's probably some kind of solution like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it did make me realize how screwed Chinese manufacturing is. like in the much nearer term than I was thinking, you know.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, like how it affects power production and agriculture. Like there's just so many things that are tied up to this. It's like, how do you get around that?
Right. So, but China loses manufacturing, and then it loses money, and it loses the money to solve the problems that it needs to solve. So, like, even if, because the CCP is actually really, really skilled at coming up with short-term solutions to solve acute problems, right?
I mean, they've held off the real estate collapse for decades now.
Yeah, and they hold off the manufacturing, or they hold off the water shortage crisis by rationing manufacturing, right? And they can also ration power when they need to ration water. So they can, but like at a certain point, but like I just never know what that point is, because they always figure out, like, I'm always surprised and kind of impressed. Like there's always some way, often a horrible way, that they're able to just like kick that can a little further down the road.
Yeah, I wonder though, right now is like a very bad time for this all to be happening because of like how badly zero COVID has wrecked the economy.
I was going to say, like, we went through this entire podcast talking about all the horrible things that are plaguing China right now, and none of them was COVID.
But I mean, yeah, even the fact that they decided to just do the kind of like let her rip thing with COVID, that they're still having economic issues because a lot of factories are like partially shut because there's just nobody to work because everybody's sick. And it's not something that's going to necessarily solve itself in like 2 days, right?
And it just kind of further emphasizes like how bad the advice is to invest in China, whether it's BlackRock saying triple your investment, or that article we just did this past weekend that was saying like, oh, the moral thing to do is to continue to invest in China.
Well, you don't
otherwise
want
people will be poor.
you don't want China to collapse, right?
No,
You know?
this was
But that's the thing, though, Matt. Like what you were talking about is like how the CCP manages to always kick the can a little further down the road, is because they have a lot of this foreign money.
Right.
And so, like, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of things like, oh, like all these foreign companies like Merrill Lynch can open a mutual fund in China now, and BlackRock can do this and that because they need to get the investment in.
Right. Well, I mean, and their solution to COVID is a good example of this, right? So, like, take how China handled COVID versus a country like Nigeria, right? Like Nigeria had very minimal measures to deal with COVID. And they just recognized that, like, we don't have a lot of resources. It's going to happen, encourage masks, get vaccines from the West where we can. And that's just how it is.
Whereas, I just need to check. Do you specifically know how Nigeria handled it, or are you guessing?
I could have sworn I read an article about it in 2020.
Okay. That's good enough fact checking.
Yeah, that's good. I read it on the internet somewhere.
Okay.
But here's the point. But what China decided to do, right, is we don't want the problems associated with COVID, such as the hospitals being crowded or the manufacturing being shut down, and therefore we're going to have zero COVID. And they put an incredible amount of resources into something that is, I would say, not an actual productive use, right? Like mass testing and quarantine centers are not actually producing goods in the economy.
They are
in the
producing GDP.
They are, right? But it's not productive in the way that that manufacturing is typically productive, right? And so because of the resources, they kicked the COVID can down the road for 3 years.
But they also did a lot of manufacturing around COVID. Masks, those full body PPE suits that all the Dabai were wearing, like,
right, and they were used domestically,
kits,
and they were used, here, even when earlier in 2021 or 2022, when the U.S. government was like, we'll buy testing kits, we'll send them to your home if you need a testing kit, and so some large percentage of those ended up being manufactured in China for American consumption.
Yep.
So it was actually a good can to kick further down the road. It's just that they're now dealing with the fallout from that, and they don't have the money to fix that fallout necessarily if they lose the manufacturing.
Unless BlackRock triples their investment.
Yes.
Well, I think there is a solution to this problem. I was telling you earlier, I saw on Twitter, some scientists saying that in the universe, the largest reservoirs of water is actually surrounding black holes. And if anything, we can say that black holes have been communism's territory since ancient times.
I feel like that was a really long premise to get to the punchline. But
Okay.
yes, okay. It works. It could have been worse. It could have been me trying to tell that joke.
So tell
Is
me
it a
about
joke?
Southland Tales.
Oh, gosh. So The Rock is autistic for some reason. And that one guy, I think he was in American Pie, he time travels.
Jason
because-
Biggs?
I think maybe that's
Okay.
him. Sarah Michelle Gellar's in it. There's a
Was this
corporation.
an early 2000s movie?
Something like that. It was by the guy who did Donnie Darko.
Okay.
And that was so successful, the studio just gave him like carte blanche to.
This is always a bad idea.
It's always a bad idea. Like Zardoz was the guy who did, I think, Deliverance or something. Yeah, Deliverance, I think. And then the studio was like, hey, just do whatever. And then they came up with Zardoz, and Donnie Darko guy came up with Southland Tales. And so there's a company that's harvesting the energy of the motion of the water, and it's called Liquid Karma. And like it brings the end of the world or something.
And this podcast reminded you of Southland Tales.
Oh, because it's something about like harvesting the motion of the ocean.
Okay.
Wow.
Okay. Maybe we should start a podcast on like terrible movies.
Or just sci-fi in general stuff.
Movies unwatched.
We watch the movies you don't want to watch for you.
And then we can do like a Mystery Science Theater 3000 type of
Basically.
commentary.
Weren't there three guys on that show? There's three of us. It's perfect.
Loosely guys. It wasn't one of them like a praying mantis or something like that, or like an alien.
No, they were
Like-
robots.
Oh, they were all robots?
One was a human.
Space Ghost.
Well, at least
You're thinking Space Ghost
Okay.
Coast to Coast.
Okay. So I'm thinking of a different thing now. Yeah.
Yes.
Huh.
I'm offended. Clearly, you are the mantis guy, though.
Okay.
What's his name? Zoltar?
Mr.
No,
Zoltar
it does
sounds
sound.
right.
It starts with a Z though.
I'm
I
pretty
think.
sure it's Zoltar.
Anyway,
We've lost the thread.
successfully
we've fallen so far
sunk
off the rails.
I mean,
Yep.
it's the first. Is this the first podcast of 2023?
We did a top 10 we filmed at the end of December that was sort of like the first of
And we published that on
Okay.
the first or second.
But
or
this
something.
is kind of our first podcast of the year. So, I'm glad we're setting ourselves up for the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really hope our guests don't actually watch the podcast they're on, so they don't see how.
Or at least
crap.
turn off.
The turn it off as soon as our guest is gone,
Yeah.
just turn it off and they don't see the ending.
Probably good advice.
Yeah. And if you're still watching this for some reason, my advice to you is to just not watch the last few minutes of the next podcast.
Yeah, the slip and slide stuff was fun when we talked about that.
I
Yeah.
always wanted one of those as a kid. That wasn't going to happen.
Oh, I had one. I slipped and fell. Myself,
So you used it once, is what you're saying.
basically.
All right. Well,
Yeah. And that is a true Southland tale. Thank you for watching China Unscripted. I'm Chris Chappell.
I'm Shelley Jong.
and I'm Matt Ganesta.
We'll see you next time.